Most people think of Bigfoot as just a monster story, a tall, hairy figure wandering through the woods, leaving behind nothing but footprints and questions. But if you go back far enough, the picture is very different. In some of the oldest stories, Bigfoot wasn't just an animal or even a mystery. He was something closer to a god, a being to be respected, even feared, and sometimes worshipped. That's the part of the story we'll drift through tonight. Hey friends, tonight we're wandering into another quiet corner of the world's old stories, a legend whispered through centuries. Maybe you've heard it before, in a book, in a film, or around a fire on a cool night, but every telling is a little different, and every listener imagines it in their own way. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's step softly into a story that has crossed oceans, slipped through centuries, and still lingers in the quiet spaces of imagination. You might picture a vast forest, dense with trees that stretch endlessly in every direction, their branches weaving a canopy that softens the daylight into shifting patterns of green and shadow. The soundscape is hushed, except for the calls of distant birds and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. For people living thousands of years ago, such an environment was both familiar and mysterious, a place where food and shelter might be found, but also where danger might lurk unseen. It is not surprising, then, that so many cultures developed stories of beings who dwelled within these wooded spaces, half familiar, half unknown, creatures who stood at the threshold between human society and the wilderness beyond. In Europe, Asia, and North America alike, one finds figures described as wild men, forest spirits, or beings that were larger, stronger, and stranger than ordinary people. These beings could be threatening, but they were also sometimes revered, treated almost like divinities or guardians of the natural world. The idea of the wild man in Europe is one of the earliest recorded examples. Medieval manuscripts and carvings often showed hairy figures, unclothed and muscular, carrying clubs or tearing branches from trees. These images decorated the margins of texts and even appeared on coats of arms. To the people who created them, such figures symbolized both the danger and the vitality of the untamed forest. They were not necessarily real in the way an animal was, but they were conceptually real, embodying fears and fascinations about what lay outside the ordered boundaries of villages and fields. You might imagine a medieval peasant seeing thick woodland rising at the edge of their farmland, hearing the cries of animals and the rustle of unseen movements, and thinking that beings like the wild man were not far away. Even earlier, the classical world had its own versions of these beings. In Greek mythology, satyrs and Silame were human-like figures with animal features who dwelled in forests and mountains. They were not giants, but they had qualities of the untamed, linked with Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstatic experience. In Roman times, writers described strange peoples at the edges of the known world, some of them hairy, some of them giant, some living lives unlike those of the Mediterranean heartland. These reports blended observation with imagination, and they show how people often filled the gaps of geography with stories of beings who existed at the boundary between human and non-human. Moving eastward, one finds the Himalayan stories of the Yeti, a figure well known today but rooted in Tibetan and Nepalese traditions that go back centuries. In these accounts, the mountains were home to beings larger than humans, covered in hair, who moved with strength and stealth. Sometimes they were considered dangerous, other times protectors, or even manifestations of spiritual forces. The cold, high-altitude environment, where snowstorms could arrive suddenly, and where travelers risked avalanches or becoming lost, was a place where the imagination naturally saw signs of more than human presences. You might imagine a caravan of traders moving through a mountain pass, snow crunching beneath their feet, and someone noticing a large footprint in the ice. With little else to explain it, the conclusion that it belonged to a mountain spirit seemed reasonable. In Russia and Central Asia, tales of the Almas describe another kind of forest or mountain dweller. These beings were said to be human-like but more primitive, hairy and strong, living in remote areas away from settled communities. Reports of encounters persisted well into modern times, though always on the fringes of society and without conclusive proof. The very persistence of these stories suggests that people in such regions found meaning in imagining a counterpart to humanity, one that shared the landscape but lived differently, closer to the earth and the wild, just as medieval Europeans placed wild men on their coats of arms, suggesting both danger and strength. So too did Siberian folklore sustain the idea of beings who were reminders of the rawness of nature. Southeast Asia has its own legends, particularly of the orang pendek in Sumatra. This figure is smaller than the giant Bigfoot of modern fame, but shares many traits. Covered in hair, elusive, and said to inhabit the dense rainforest, for local communities, stories of the orang pendek fit into broader traditions of spirits and hidden animals that shape the forest environment. Dense jungles with their heavy humidity, constant insect sounds, and towering trees can create an atmosphere where it seems something might always be watching. In such an environment, the line between animal, spirit, and human can blur, giving rise to stories that reflect both ecological realities and human imagination. When you look across these examples, the wild men of Europe, the satyrs of Greece, the yeti of the Himalaya, the almas of Central Asia, and the orang pendek of Sumatra, you see a broad human tendency to imagine beings who are like us but different, who live at the boundary of society and wilderness. These figures are not identical, but they resonate with one another. They suggest that people everywhere, when faced with forests and mountains, projected into those spaces the image of a being that was powerful, hidden, and connected to forces greater than ordinary humans. This pattern sets the stage for understanding how, in North America, stories of beings like Bigfoot or Sasq'ets emerged. The North American forests are vast, stretching across immense distances, filled with coniferous trees in the north and mixed hardwoods further south. Indigenous peoples lived with and within these landscapes for thousands of years, and their traditions reflect deep knowledge of plants, animals, and spirits. Among the Coast Salish peoples of the Pacific Northwest, there are stories of beings called Sasq'ets, which later gave rise to the word Sasquatch. These beings were not just animals, they had qualities of the spiritual and the sacred. They could be seen as protectors of the forest, warnings against disrespect, or symbols of powers beyond ordinary human control. In this sense, they occupied a space closer to divinity than to simple monster. In Salish tradition, Sasq'ets was a figure who connected the human world with the wild. To speak of Sasq'ets was to speak of balance, of remembering that people were not alone in the forest, but shared it with forces that deserved respect. The name itself carried weight, reminding listeners of the ancient relationship between people and their environment. You might picture a community gathered around a fire, with elders telling stories to the younger generation, their voices calm and deliberate, weaving lessons into narrative. The forest outside would be dark, filled with the sounds of wind through trees and nocturnal animals, and the idea that a powerful being moved unseen among those trees gave shape to the sense of mystery. Different nations had different versions of such beings. Among the Centaurols, the Sasq'ets was a central figure, while other groups had their own names and interpretations. Sometimes the being was thought of as dangerous, a figure who might take children who strayed too far. Other times it was seen as a teacher, one who reminded humans to behave properly, to show respect to the natural world. This duality, fear and reverence, mirrors the way forests themselves were experienced. Places of sustenance, but also of risk, of beauty, but also of peril. In this balance, one can see why such a figure might be understood, not simply as a wild man, but as a kind of godlike presence. When European settlers began to move into the forests of North America, they brought with them their own traditions of wild men and giants. They heard indigenous stories and interpreted them through their own frameworks, often reducing spiritual beings to the level of mere curiosities or frightening monsters. Yet in doing so, they preserved fragments of the deeper meaning. Even if altered, reports of hairy giant beings in the woods began to circulate more widely, blending indigenous tradition with European folklore and settler experience. This process illustrates how myths evolve, taking on new shapes as cultures meet and as languages shift. To understand why Bigfoot could be thought of as divine, one must appreciate the way indigenous traditions view the world. In many such worldviews, there is not a strict separation between human, animal, and spirit. Instead, the world is filled with beings who occupy different roles, each deserving of recognition. A creature like Sasq'ets might walk on two legs like a human, live in the forest like an animal, and embody spiritual power like a god. This fluidity is foreign to Western categories but deeply meaningful within the traditions that shaped these stories. To reduce Bigfoot to a simple monster is to miss the way it functioned as a symbol of respect, warning, and connection to larger forces. The forests of the Pacific Northwest, where these traditions are strongest, provide the right backdrop for such beliefs. Towering evergreens create a sense of enclosure, while rivers and rain feed an environment lush and abundant. For people who depended on salmon runs, seasonal gathering, and careful management of resources, the forest was both generous and fragile. Stories of beings like Sasq'ets reminded communities of the importance of humility. Just as crops and hunting could fail if not treated with care, so too could balance with the spiritual world be disrupted if disrespect was shown. In this way, Bigfoot was not merely a story, but part of an ethical framework, guiding behavior and reinforcing communal values. If one compares this to other traditions, one sees similarities. In the Himalaya, Yetis were sometimes considered manifestations of spiritual forces, connected with Buddhist and shamanic practices. In Europe, wild men could symbolize the untamed, but also be included in heraldry, suggesting power and identity. In Sumatra, Orang Pendek was woven into a cultural landscape of spirits. Each of these reflects a worldview where the boundaries between categories are porous. Bigfoot, in its indigenous form, fits into this larger pattern, reminding us that the idea of a forest giant was never merely about physicality, but also about meaning. The transformation of these stories over time illustrates how cultural contact and historical change shape legends. What began as Sasq'ets, a being with godlike aspects, became, through settler retellings and popular imagination, Bigfoot, a cryptid pursued for evidence. This shift parallels other changes, such as how mermaids once symbolized dangerous sea spirits but later became romanticized figures in literature. Legends adapt, yet their roots often contain richer, more complex meanings than later versions suggest. To remember Bigfoot as once divine is to glimpse those older layers, to hear in the quiet of the forest an echo of reverence as well as fear. You might imagine a medieval manuscript, copied carefully by hand in a quiet scriptorium. The scribe pauses for a moment, stretches his ink-stained fingers, and then adds a small illustration in the margin, a wild man covered in hair, carrying a club. To the modern eye, such an image seems almost whimsical, but to people of the Middle Ages, it conveyed a reminder that just beyond the orderly fields and villages lay an unpredictable world. The forests were dense and dark, filled with animals but also with imagined figures who embodied untamed strength. This is how many Europeans first gave shape to their sense of the wilderness, a figure that was both frightening and fascinating, neither wholly human nor wholly animal. It is a picture of distance, of something known only indirectly, but it also contains a measure of reverence, as if to say that what dwells in the wild deserves to be taken seriously. In the high valleys of the Himalaya, where wind whistles through prayer flags and icy ridges shimmer in the sun, stories of the Yeti served a similar role. Here, the environment is stark, with thin air, sudden storms, and avalanches that can wipe out a caravan in moments. Local traditions describe beings taller than ordinary humans, covered in fur, leaving footprints in snowfields where no person could easily walk. For some, these Yetis were dangerous, but others treated them as protectors of mountain sanctuaries. The way monasteries painted them alongside other symbolic beings shows that they were not only feared, but also integrated into the spiritual landscape. It is easy to imagine a traveller pausing before a monastery wall, seeing an image of a Yeti painted near other deities, and understanding that the wild itself was part of the sacred order. Russia's Almaz traditions add another strand. The Russian Empire, with its vast stretches of steppe, mountain, and forest, had room for stories of hidden peoples who lived beyond the reach of cities. Accounts describe them as hairy, shy, and strong, able to evade hunters, yet leaving signs of their presence. Travelers in the Caucasus sometimes reported encountering them. In the 19th and 20th centuries, when ethnographers began to collect local folklore, these reports were written down with careful attention. The idea persisted that the Almaz were not merely beasts but something closer to human, perhaps even a remnant of an earlier age. This notion reveals a deep human tendency to imagine that the past is not gone but still walks among us, hidden in valleys and mountain forests. In the humid forests of Sumatra, the Orang Pendek fills a similar place in the imagination. Unlike Bigfoot, it is said to be short rather than tall, but the qualities are parallel: hairy, elusive, avoiding human contact, yet undeniably present in stories. The dense vegetation of tropical forests amplifies the sense of mystery. Vines hang like curtains, insects buzz constantly, and the air itself feels heavy with moisture. In such an environment, a sudden sound or fleeting glimpse can easily be woven into a tale of a hidden being. The Orang Pendek, like Bigfoot, functions not only as a possible creature, but also as a narrative vessel for human feelings about the unknown spaces that surround daily life. North America, with its vast coniferous forests and mountain ranges, provided fertile ground for such traditions. Among the coast Salish peoples, the figure of Sasq'ets is well known. To say the name is to invoke more than a simple description. It points to a being with presence, authority, and meaning. Elders told stories of Sasq'ets not as idle tales, but as part of moral education. Children were reminded that the forest was not theirs to exploit carelessly. Hunters were taught to act with humility, to take only what was needed, and to remember that the woods held powers beyond their understanding. In this way, Sasq'ets occupied a place much closer to a god than a beast. Ethnographers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries recorded these accounts, though often through the filter of their own expectations. Some reduced the stories to curiosities, noting them down as examples of savage superstition, yet careful listening reveals layers of meaning. For the Sasq'ets Nation, for example, Sasq'ets was considered a real and important presence, tied to ceremonies and traditions. In oral histories, he appeared not just as a figure of fear, but as a reminder of right living. To an outsider, such nuance might be missed, but within the community it was central. This is one of the reasons the memory of Sasq'ets remains alive, even after centuries of cultural pressure and change. The forests of the Pacific Northwest are themselves instructive. Standing among towering cedars and Douglas firs, one can feel dwarfed by the scale of the environment. Moss clings to branches, streams cut through ravines, and the air smells of damp earth and resin. For indigenous communities who lived within this ecosystem, the forest was both home and mystery. Salmon runs sustained life, but a failed run could bring hardship. Weather could shift quickly, with rain arriving suddenly from the ocean. In such a place, the sense that a great being dwelled unseen among the trees carried weight. It was not a story of idle fancy, but an acknowledgement of reality as they perceived it. Comparisons with European traditions show interesting contrasts. The wild man in medieval imagery often symbolized danger and chaos, an outsider to civilization. By contrast, Sasq'ets was woven into the order of the world, part of the balance of existence. Both traditions recognize a figure at the boundary of the human and the natural, but where one saw disorder, the other saw integration. This difference reflects broader cultural patterns, a European worldview that often separated nature from culture, and an indigenous worldview that emphasized interconnection. To see Bigfoot as a god is to see him not as chaos but as order, a reminder that humans are not above the forest but within it. When Europeans encountered these stories, they tended to reinterpret them. Settlers brought their own folklore of giants and wild men, and when they heard indigenous accounts, they often translated them into familiar categories. What had been spiritual became monstrous, what had been instructive became curious. In this process, the divine qualities of Sasq'ets were obscured, yet fragments remained, embedded in the evolving figure of Bigfoot. One might say that modern Bigfoot is like a palimpsest. Beneath the popular image of a hairy cryptid lie older layers of meaning, faint but still present. Anthropologists such as Franz Boas, who worked extensively with indigenous communities of the northwest coast, help preserve some of these traditions. Boas, often called the father of American anthropology, collected myths, rituals, and linguistic data. Although his work was shaped by his own scholarly interests, he took seriously the idea that indigenous cultures had coherence and depth. In his writings, one can find references to beings like Sasq'ets, noted alongside other mythic and spiritual figures. Boas himself was interested in cultural relativism, the idea that each culture should be understood on its own terms. Applying this lens, one sees that Sasq'ets cannot simply be equated with a monster, but must be understood as a figure of reverence within its original context. If you consider daily life in an indigenous village of the northwest coast, you might picture longhouses built from cedar planks, smoke rising from fires inside, and the smell of drying salmon hanging from rafters. The sound of drums and rattles might accompany a winter ceremony, in which masked dancers reenact ancestral stories. Within such a rhythm of life, the figure of Sasq'ets was more than a tale told to pass the time. It was part of the moral and spiritual framework of the community. The forest outside the village was not just a source of wood and game, but a sacred space. Sasq'ets, moving unseen within it, represented that sacredness in a tangible form. The theme of reverence for forest beings is not unique to North America. In Japan, for example, Shinto traditions speak of kami, spirits who dwell in natural features such as trees, rocks, and rivers. A towering cedar might be seen as the seat of a spirit, marked with a rope and honored with offerings. Though the details differ, the underlying idea that the natural world is alive with presence parallels the way Sasq'ets was seen. Such comparisons remind us that the perception of divinity in the non-human world is widespread, not confined to any single region. Bigfoot as a god fits into this larger human pattern of recognizing sacredness in the wild. Even in Europe, despite the dominant image of the wild man as chaotic, there were currents of reverence. Some medieval stories told of wild men possessing hidden wisdom, able to survive in forests where ordinary people could not. Heraldic use of wild men on coats of arms sometimes suggested strength and resilience, qualities admired even if feared. The ambivalence itself, part threat, part respect, mirrors the ambivalence seen elsewhere. Humans have long lived with the sense that the forest is both an adversary and an ally, both a source of danger and a source of life. The beings imagined within it reflect that duality. To walk through a forest at night is to feel this directly. The air grows cooler, the sounds shift from birdsong to the calls of nocturnal animals, and the darkness seems to thicken. Each crack of a branch might be a deer, a bear, or something unknown. For those who lived by the forest, these experiences were not rare but regular. Over generations, they gave rise to stories that carried both caution and awe. Sasq'ets embodies that mixture. He is not only a figure of fear but also a figure of presence, a reminder that one should walk carefully, speak respectfully, and live with awareness of forces greater than oneself. When modern people speak of Bigfoot, they often focus on footprints, blurry photographs, or alleged sightings. These are treated as evidence for or against existence, yet to focus solely on that is to miss the deeper story. The question is not simply whether Bigfoot exists, but what Bigfoot means. In the forgotten time when he was a god, Bigfoot or Sasq'ets meant balance, reverence, and connection. Remembering this does not solve the question of physical evidence, but it does enrich our understanding of the legend. It places the figure back into the forest, back into the sacred context from which it emerged. If you step quietly into the traditions of the Pacific Northwest, you begin to hear echoes of stories that stretch back long before written history. These are oral traditions, carried in the voices of elders, woven into ceremonies, and remembered in the language of the land itself. One of the most enduring of these figures is Sasq'ets, whose name in the Hul'qumi'num language of the Sinsalils people later gave rise to the modern word Sasquatch. The pronunciation has shifted, but the memory is far older, rooted in a worldview that sees the forest not as empty space, but as a living community filled with powers, presences, and responsibilities. To hear the name Sasq'ets in its original context is to hear not only a description, but also a reminder. There are beings larger than us, and they deserve both caution and respect. Daily life in such communities was closely tied to cycles of nature. Salmon runs in the rivers, berry harvests in the summer, hunting in the forests. All of these provided sustenance but required careful balance. The stories told at night by the fire were not merely entertainment. They were ways of transmitting knowledge. You might imagine children sitting near the warmth of cedar logs, their faces flickering in the firelight, as an elder recounts how Sasq'ets moves through the forest. The lesson might be to avoid straying too far alone, or to respect certain areas where spirits dwell, or to remember that greed brings consequences. In this setting, Sasq'ets is not a frightening monster, but a teaching presence, an embodiment of the moral and ecological wisdom of the community. Among the coast Salish, Sasq'ets had multiple roles. In some stories, he was a giant with strength beyond ordinary humans, capable of carrying away those who acted unwisely. In others, he was a guardian of particular groves or mountains. The dual role of threat and protector is familiar in mythologies worldwide, but here it was expressed in a way that reinforced social values. To say that Sasq'ets could take a child who wandered too far was not to create senseless fear, but to keep children safe from the dangers of dense woods and swift rivers. To say that he guarded certain places was to maintain respect for ecosystems that might be fragile or sacred. In both cases, the story guided behavior in ways that protected the community. If you travel further south and east, into the traditions of the Cherokee, you encounter another figure known as Sul'kalu'. His name is sometimes translated as the slant-eyed giant or the beautiful hairy man, depending on context. He was said to dwell in the mountains, a being both feared and revered. To the Cherokee, Sul'kalu' was not simply an animal, but but a presence who lived at the margins of human space. His home was thought to be Pilot Mountain, a place still marked in oral tradition. Hunters would leave offerings for him, acknowledging his power and hoping for his favor. Such practices remind us that these beings were not just stories but part of ritual interaction with the land. In Algonquin traditions, stories of giants also appear, though here they intersect with other figures such as the Wendigo. The Wendigo is often described as a cannibalistic spirit, associated with cold, hunger, and excess. While it differs from Sasq'ets or Sul'Kulu, the fact that these figures coexist in oral traditions shows the richness of indigenous cosmologies, where one figure warns against disrespecting the forest, another warns against greed and imbalance in times of scarcity. To a listener, both figures remind them that life is precarious, that survival requires humility, and that unseen forces must be taken seriously. The presence of multiple such beings suggests that North American landscapes were understood as spiritually crowded, alive with figures whose stories helped shape human conduct. Anthropologists who recorded these traditions sometimes missed their depth, but when read carefully, the accounts reveal an understanding of Bigfoot-like beings as teachers and guardians. For example, ethnographer James Tite, working in the early 20th century with interior Salish groups, collected narratives of large hairy beings who lived in the mountains. They were not considered animals but were spoken of with the same seriousness as ancestral spirits. In his notes, Tite recorded how these beings were part of initiation stories, marking transitions in a young person's life. To meet such a being, even in a vision, was to be changed, to carry new responsibility. Here again, the being functions in a way close to divinity, guiding human lives in ways beyond the ordinary. The languages of these peoples also encode meaning. In many indigenous languages, the names of beings are not arbitrary but descriptive, connecting them to qualities of the land or to actions they perform. The word Sasq'ets, for instance, carries connotations that go beyond what English can easily capture. To speak it within the rhythm of Halkamelem is to place the figure within a network of stories, ceremonies, and place names. This is why translation can so often distort meaning. Where English hears a wild man, the original language carries associations of spirit, respect, and kinship with the natural world. To approach these stories with care is to hear that richness. The settings of these traditions are important as well. Imagine the Pacific Northwest not as it is today, dotted with highways and towns, but as it was centuries ago, immense forests stretching for days of travel, rivers teeming with salmon, and mountains rising sharply from coastal plains. In such an environment, one could easily feel the presence of beings larger than oneself. At night, when fog drifted through the trees and owls called from hidden perches, the forest seemed to breathe. In such a world, Sasq'ets was not far-fetched but natural. To believe in his presence was to believe that the forest had its own life and will. Comparisons with the Himalaya again come to mind. Just as Tibetans viewed the Yeti as part of a sacred landscape, so too did the Coast Salish view Sasq'ets as part of theirs. Both figures were tied to places, the Yeti to snowfields and high passes, Sasq'ets to deep woods and shadowed valleys. Both served as reminders of humility. Travelers in both regions knew that arrogance toward the land could be punished. The figures embodied this lesson, turning ecological truth into narrative form. The parallels are striking and suggest that humans across cultures have long used such beings to articulate their relationship with challenging environments. One can also think of Sasq'ets of a larger pantheon of beings. Indigenous cosmologies often included animal spirits, tricksters, and ancestral figures. Raven, coyote, thunderbird. These are names that appear again and again, each with its own stories and lessons. Sasq'ets belongs alongside them, not as an outsider but as one of many beings who shape the world. In ceremonies, masks representing these figures were worn, dances performed, and songs sung. To see Sasq'ets in this context is to recognize that he was never alone, but part of a spiritual ecology. His godlike qualities become clearer when one sees how he functioned as one node in a web of sacred beings. When Europeans later turned Sasq'ets into Bigfoot, they stripped away much of this context. The being became singular, isolated, reduced to a cryptid to be proven or disproven. But in his original context, Sasq'ets was relational. He connected humans to forests, to morality, and to the divine. Remembering this reshapes the modern question. Instead of asking whether Bigfoot exists, one can ask what Sasq'ets meant and still means within indigenous frameworks. The answer is not about footprints or sightings, but about reverence, caution, and the intertwining of human life with the natural world. Even the way Sasq'ets is said to appear carries meaning. Accounts describe him as tall, strong, covered in hair, with a powerful odor. Such details might seem purely physical, but they also signal liminality. Hairiness marks him as outside ordinary humanity. Height makes him imposing, larger than life. Odor sets him apart, a sensory reminder that he belongs to another realm. In anthropology, such markers are common in descriptions of beings who cross boundaries. Shamans, gods, spirits. They are set apart not only by what they do, but by how they are perceived through all the senses. Sasq'ets fits this pattern, reinforcing his status as more than an ordinary being. Children learning these stories would have grown up with a worldview in which Sasq'ets was simply part of reality. Just as adults taught them about fishing techniques or berry gathering, they taught them about spiritual beings. Knowledge was not compartmentalized into real and unreal, but flowed together. The stories of Sasq'ets guided behavior just as surely as instructions on building canoes or preparing nets. To understand this is to see why calling Bigfoot a myth misses the point. He was and is part of a lived cosmology, one that shaped generations. Among the Iroquois of the Northeast, stories tell of beings known as stone giants. These figures were immense, clothed in skin said to be as hard as rock, impervious to weapons. They roamed forests and mountains, sometimes as enemies of humanity, sometimes as reminders of power beyond human strength. Their size and endurance marked them as more than ordinary, and though they were feared, their presence in oral tradition reveals respect as well. Just as Sasq'ets could not be thought of as a simple animal, the stone giants were not just enemies but mythic beings who gave shape to human fears of vulnerability. When one imagines the long winters of the Great Lakes region, with snow blanketing the land and survival precarious, it is not difficult to see why beings of massive strength and endurance would take form in the stories of the people. The Miwok of California tell of beings called yayas, described as hairy giants who lived in the mountains. These stories were not intended as curiosities but as part of the moral landscape. The yayas might punish arrogance or carelessness, or they might serve as reminders that certain areas were not to be disturbed. Living in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, Miwok communities would have known the vastness of those mountains, the way mist clings to granite cliffs at dawn, and the sound of unseen movement in the trees. Within such a setting, the yayas gave voice to the sense of unseen presence. They joined a host of other beings in Miwok cosmology, forming part of a complex network of meaning that tied people to land, animals, and spirit. Farther north, the Kwakwaka'wakwa people of Vancouver Island speak of Dzunuqua, a giant woman, hairy and formidable, who lived in the forest. Often described with a deep, resonant call, Dzunuqua was both feared and revered. In some stories she was dangerous, stealing children. In others, she was a bringer of wealth and good fortune. This duality reflects once more the ambivalence of wilderness, both threat and gift. During potlatch ceremonies, masks representing Dzunuqua were worn, her presence invoked through dance and song. The masks themselves, carved from cedar, painted with black and red pigments, and finished with human hair, are works of art that embody spiritual presence. To see a dancer wearing such a mask by firelight accompanied by drums would be to experience Dzunuqua as more than a tale. She was made present, a living force within ritual. The Hoopa people of Northern California also hold traditions of forest beings. In some stories they are described as large, hairy, and living in the mountains, often appearing at the edges of human settlements. These beings, sometimes called Om-Ma, carried connotations of power and mystery. They were not hunted or treated as animals, but recognized as part of the order of things, respected and spoken of carefully. For the Hoopa, whose ceremonies linked humans to the wider cosmos, such beings fitted naturally into a world where the sacred and the natural overlapped. Daily life, from fishing in rivers to burning meadows for acorn harvests, was conducted with awareness that spirits shared the land. To speak of Om-Ma was to acknowledge that the forest was not empty, but inhabited by presences both seen and unseen. Even among the Lakota, whose homelands were primarily prairie, there are accounts of large, hairy beings at the edges of forests and mountains. While less central than among the Salish or Kwakwaka'wakw, these figures still held meaning. The Lakota worldview emphasized the interrelatedness of all beings, expressed in the phrase Mitakuye Oyasin, all are related. To include hairy giants within that circle of relationship was natural. They were kin of a different kind, not to be dismissed, but recognized as part of the larger web of existence. This perspective reinforces the theme that Bigfoot-like beings, across cultures, were not monsters but nodes in a spiritual ecology. If you imagine the rhythm of daily life in these communities, the presence of such beings feels natural. People woke with the sun, tended fires, prepared food, and moved through landscapes rich with sound and scent. Cedar smoke, drying salmon, crushed berries, all mingled with the earthy aroma of forest soil and rain. Children played near the edges of villages, elders carved wood into tools or masks, and hunters returned with deer or elk. Within this cadence of life, stories of Sasq'ets, or Dzunukwa, were not abstractions but part of the environment. The forest itself was alive, and these beings were expressions of its presence. They were spoken of in the same breath as weather, rivers, or ancestral stories. To live with them was to live with awareness of a world filled with more than the visible. Ethnographers who visited these communities often noted how such beings were integrated into ritual, potlatch ceremonies, initiation rites, seasonal dances. All might feature masks or stories invoking forest giants. Anthropologist Franz Boas described Kwakwakawakawak ceremonies where Dzunukwa masks were worn, her booming voice imitated through wooden trumpets. To the outside observer, this might have seemed performance, but within the community it was presence. Dzunukwa made manifest, reminding participants of her power. In this way, the divine qualities of Bigfoot-like beings were embodied, enacted, and experienced directly. Comparisons outside North America again help illuminate this. In Siberia, shamans invoked forest spirits through drums and costume, embodying presences that were not otherwise visible. In Japan, no theatre often represented kami, allowing audiences to experience spiritual presence through performance. The Northwest Coast traditions fit within this global pattern. Ritual as a way of making invisible beings present. When one sees Sasq'ets or Dzunukwa in this light, their godlike character becomes clearer. They were not simply told of, they were invoked, embodied, and experienced. Even the geography of these traditions carries significance. The mountains of the Cherokee, the forests of the Kwakwaka'wakw, the valleys of the Miwok. Each landscape shapes the beings imagined within it. Tall mountains yield giants, dense forests yield hidden presences, cold winters yield beings of endurance. The beings reflect the land as much as the land reflects the beings. This is why oral traditions are so rooted in place. To remove Sasq'ets from the cedar forests is to strip him of meaning, just as to remove the Yeti from the Himalaya would be to misunderstand him. Place and presence are inseparable. For the communities themselves, these beings were woven into practical life. Hunters left offerings, mothers used stories to guide children, and ceremonies reaffirmed communal ties with spirits. These practices show that Bigfoot-like figures were not only myth but also practice, woven into the very fabric of how people lived. To call them gods is not to impose an outside label, but to recognize that they functioned in ways parallel to divinities elsewhere, embodying sacred presence, guiding behavior, and connecting humans with forces beyond themselves. When European settlers encountered these traditions, they often misunderstood them. They saw only superstition or curiosities, not realizing the depth of meaning. Over time, as settler society expanded, the stories were retold in altered form. Sasq'ets became Bigfoot, stripped of his ceremonial presence, reduced to a mystery animal. The divine qualities faded, but they were never entirely erased. Beneath the modern legend of Bigfoot, as an elusive creature, lies the older memory of Sasq'ets, as a godlike being, part of a sacred order. To recall this is to restore some of the depth that has been lost. When Europeans first settled along the coasts of North America, they carried with them their own traditions of wild men, giants, and forest spirits. In medieval Europe, the wild man had already been a common figure, painted into manuscripts and carved into the stonework of churches. He was hairy, strong, and unruly, a symbol of wilderness and of the untamed forces outside the borders of towns. Settlers, hearing indigenous stories of Sasq'ets and similar beings, naturally translated them into this familiar figure. To their ears, what they heard sounded like a New World version of the wild man. Yet what was lost in translation was the reverence for the stars or the Kwakwaka'wakw. Sasq'ets and Dumquak carried sacred presence for Europeans. They became curiosities, creatures, or at times even threats to be overcome. The subtle shift from god to monster happened quickly, and it would shape the image of Bigfoot for centuries to come. Frontier life encouraged this shift. The forests of early colonial America were vast, stretching in unbroken swaths from the Atlantic coast to the interior. For settlers, these forests were both resource and obstacle. Timber was needed for ships, houses, and fences, but the density of trees and the difficulty of clearing land made farming hard. Within this setting, stories of hairy forest beings took on new hues. They became symbols of the untamed land itself, a land that had to be subdued and transformed into fields, towns, and cities. Where indigenous stories had emphasized respect and balance, settler stories often emphasized conquest. To imagine a hairy giant in the woods was to imagine the wilderness itself as something to be defeated. Accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries occasionally mention encounters with wild men or strange beings in the woods. These were sometimes second-hand tales, passed along in taverns or noted briefly in journals. They rarely carried the sacred overtones of indigenous traditions. Instead, they were framed as oddities or unexplained curiosities. The difference in framing reflects the cultural mindset. For settlers steeped in Protestant traditions, the world was sharply divided between human and non-human, godly and ungodly. Beings that blurred the boundary were uncomfortable, so they were reduced either to animals or to tricks of the imagination. This reduction flattened the figure of Sasq'ets into something far less complex, a fate shared by many indigenous spiritual beings once colonial narratives took hold. By the 19th century, as settlers pushed westward, the figure of Bigfoot-like beings became further entangled with frontier lore. The frontier was filled with tall tales. Paul Bunyan felling forests with a single swing of his axe, Pecos Bill lassoing tornadoes, and Davy Crockett wrestling bears. Within this world of exaggeration and bravado, stories of hairy giants fit naturally. Travelers spoke of seeing enormous tracks by rivers, or of shadowy figures vanishing into forests. These stories mingled with indigenous accounts, but were retold in new tones, emphasizing entertainment and astonishment rather than reverence. The divine qualities slipped further into the background, replaced by a fascination with size, strangeness, and the thrill of the unknown. Yet, even in this retelling, fragments of the older reverence survived. Some settlers, especially those who lived close to indigenous communities, noted that the local people treated these beings with respect. Hunters might speak of leaving offerings, or of avoiding certain areas known to be the dwelling places of giants. Such details, recorded in scattered diaries and ethnographic notes, remind us that the memory of Bigfoot as more than an animal never entirely disappeared. It lingered in whispers, half heard by outsiders, but deeply understood by those who continued to live within indigenous frameworks. The forests themselves also played a role in shaping these evolving narratives. In the Pacific Northwest, old-growth cedar and fir trees rose hundreds of feet, their trunks so wide that several people holding hands could barely encircle them. The canopy dimmed the light, creating a perpetual twilight even at midday. Moss and lichen draped the branches, and fallen logs formed damp, sponge-like carpets underfoot. In such an environment, it was easy for the imagination to populate the shadows with unseen beings. For indigenous peoples, these shadows were filled with sacred presence. For settlers, they were often filled with danger or curiosity. The same forest could hold very different meanings depending on the cultural lens through which it was seen. The Industrial Revolution deepened these differences. As logging expanded in the 19th century, the forests of the Pacific Northwest became resources to be harvested on an industrial scale. Logging camps sprang up, railways carried timber, and newspapers reported on the wealth to be gained from cutting trees. Within this context, stories of hairy giants sometimes appeared in local papers, framed as curiosities or jokes among lumberjacks. Tales circulated of enormous footprints found near camps, or of strange cries echoing through valleys at night. Some workers may have repeated older indigenous stories they had heard, but the framing was different. What had once been sacred became campfire amusement. This shift shows how industrial culture transformed not only landscapes, but also the meanings attached to them. Even so, traces of reverence occasionally emerged. Some loggers refused to work in certain groves, said to be haunted by the presence of Sasq'ets. Others spoke with unease of areas where tools would go missing or where strange noises unsettled the camp. While these reports were often dismissed as superstition, they suggest that even within industrial contexts, the memory of a sacred presence in the forest could not be fully erased. The figure of Bigfoot carried enough weight that even hardened workers felt a lingering sense of respect, or at least caution toward the idea of his presence. In the 20th century, Bigfoot's image crystallized further into the cryptid familiar today. Reports of sightings multiplied, especially after the famous 1958 discovery of large footprints near Bluff Creek in California. The term Bigfoot itself entered popular usage at this time, coined by newspapers to describe the prints. The being was no longer tied to specific indigenous traditions, but had become a generalized mystery figure. Television, radio, and later film amplified this image, presenting Bigfoot as an elusive, possibly undiscovered primate. The divine layers were almost entirely forgotten in mainstream culture. Instead, Bigfoot became an object of scientific curiosity, ridicule, or popular fascination. And yet even here, the older resonances lingered. The very fascination with Bigfoot, the sense of awe at the possibility of a hidden being, echoes the reverence once attached to Sasq'ets. When people trek into forests today, hoping for a glimpse or a footprint, they reenact in secular form what once was a spiritual practice, seeking contact with the sacred presence of the wilderness. The modern cryptid hunt, though stripped of ceremony, carries an echo of older rituals. It reminds us that beneath the laughter and skepticism, there remains a human desire to connect with the unseen, to believe that the forest holds mysteries greater than ourselves. The transformation of Bigfoot from god to cryptid illustrates a larger cultural pattern. Sacred beings across the world have often been reinterpreted as monsters, fairies, or curiosities once viewed through outside eyes. The Greek satyrs, once associated with fertility rituals, later became comic figures in plays. Celtic deities, absorbed into Christian Europe, sometimes became fairies or demons. Sasq'ets followed a similar path, shifting from a sacred guardian to a wilderness monster. This process reveals as much about cultural change as it does about the beings themselves. It shows how colonization, industrialization, and modern media reshape stories, often flattening them into simpler forms. At the same time, the persistence of Bigfoot reminds us that stories are resilient. Even when stripped of context, they endure. The being remains compelling, drawing the attention of believers, skeptics, and storytellers alike. The survival of Bigfoot in popular imagination, even in altered form, testifies to the strength of the older traditions beneath it. Like a faint outline beneath a painting, the godlike Sasq'ets can still be glimpsed if one looks carefully. He is not gone, only hidden, much like the forest itself conceals what lives within it. Life in a 19th century logging camp was demanding, often harsh, and it carried its own rhythms. Workers rose before dawn, the air damp with mist, and gathered around campfires or in simple bunkhouses built of rough-cut timber. Meals were plain but heavy, meant to sustain long hours of physical labor: bread, beans, salted pork, sometimes dried apples or molasses. The sounds of axes striking trees, saws grinding through trunks, and the distant crash of falling timber filled the day. In the evenings, after hours of cutting, dragging, and hauling, men returned to camp with aching muscles, their clothes smelling of pine resin and smoke. It was in these twilight hours, when fatigue mixed with the flicker of firelight, that stories took shape. Tales of giants in the woods, of footsteps larger than a man's outstretched hand, or of eerie cries echoing through valleys, spread easily among crews who lived so close to wilderness. The loggers' environment encouraged such storytelling. Camps were often situated in remote valleys, with towering forests pressing in on all sides. At night the wind creaked through branches, owls hooted unseen, and rivers rushed over stones with an endless low roar. Darkness came quickly under the canopy, and once the fires dimmed, shadows stretched deep and impenetrable. Within this sensory world, the imagination filled gaps readily. When tools went missing, or when animals stirred at night, men were quick to whisper of hairy giants. Such stories provided both entertainment and explanation. They linked workers to older oral traditions, sometimes without the men realizing they were echoing indigenous frameworks. Even stripped of ritual meaning, the tales gave shape to the unease of living at the boundary between human labor and an immense, untamed forest. The Bluff Creek incident of 1958 illustrates how these traditions shifted into modern folklore. That year, construction crews working on logging roads in Northern California discovered a series of large footprints in the mud, measuring around 16 inches in length. The prints could not be explained by ordinary wildlife. A reporter, Andrew Gensely, published the story in the Humboldt Times, coining the term Bigfoot to describe the mysterious track maker. The article caught the imagination of the public, and within weeks letters poured in from readers claiming to have seen similar tracks or figures. What had begun as a localized curiosity quickly became a cultural phenomenon. The very name Bigfoot, casual and journalistic in origin, detached the being from its indigenous context and fixed it in the public imagination as a creature of mystery. The media played a central role in amplifying the story. Newspapers across the United States reprinted accounts of the tracks, sometimes with sketches showing the scale of the footprints compared to human shoes. Radio broadcasts carried interviews with locals, while magazines speculated about whether the being might be a surviving prehistoric creature. For many listeners, the idea resonated with mid-20th century fascination with science and discovery. The 1950s were marked by explorations of space, the deep sea, and the atomic age. To imagine that a hidden giant lived in the forests of California seemed to fit perfectly into a decade enthralled by the unknown. In this way, Bigfoot was reframed once again, not as god or monster, but as a potential zoological discovery waiting to be confirmed. The most famous moment came less than a decade later, in 1967, with the Patterson-Gimlin film. Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin, riding horseback near Bluff Creek, claimed to have encountered a large, hairy figure walking upright along a sandbar. Patterson filmed the figure with a handheld camera, creating a brief but now iconic sequence. The footage showed the figure striding across the frame, turning its head briefly toward the camera before disappearing into the forest. Grainy, shaky, and brief, the film nonetheless became one of the most analyzed pieces of footage in popular culture. For some, it was definitive proof. For others, it was a clever hoax. Regardless of authenticity, the film solidified Bigfoot's place in American folklore. The sacred Sasq'ets had become an object of debate, studied frame by frame not for moral lessons but for biological possibility. If one looks carefully, however, the persistence of awe in these stories is telling. The excitement around Bluff Creek and the Patterson-Gimlin film was not simply about whether Bigfoot was real. It was also about what the possibility represented, that the world might still contain mysteries, that the forests might not be fully mapped, that something larger than humanity might remain hidden in the shadows. This echo of reverence is a faint memory of Sasq'ets as a divine presence. Even when reinterpreted through the lens of modern science and skepticism, the emotional core remains similar. Humans still long to believe that the forest holds something beyond their control. Similar processes of transformation can be found in other cultures. Consider the Selkies of Scottish and Irish folklore. These beings, seals that could shed their skins to become human, were once tied to ancient beliefs about the sea and its spirits. Over centuries, they shifted from sacred figures to fairy tale characters, sometimes romanticized, sometimes ridiculed. The same happened with trolls in Scandinavia. Once beings tied to mountains and earth, they became children's tales, stripped of their darker or more sacred qualities. Even fairies, originally linked to older deities, became tiny winged creatures in Victorian art, far removed from their original roles. Bigfoot's transformation fits neatly within this pattern. Sacred beings, when filtered through new cultural lenses, are often reduced to curiosities or entertainment. Daily life in the 20th century further reinforced this shift. As television became a fixture in homes, programs on mysteries and unexplained phenomena began to flourish. Bigfoot appeared alongside UFOs, the Loch Ness Monster, and ghosts as part of a catalogue of mysteries. Viewers tuned in not to engage with sacred traditions, but to be entertained, to marvel at the strangeness of the world from the comfort of their living rooms. Meanwhile, souvenir shops in the Pacific Northwest began selling Bigfoot-themed trinkets, keychains, bumper stickers, coffee mugs. The sacred figure who once guarded forests and carried lessons of respect became a commercial mascot, smiling from tourist brochures. And yet, even here, the pattern of reverence survives in subtle ways. To this day, hikers who venture deep into the forests sometimes describe a feeling of unease, a sense of being watched, or an awareness of presence that is hard to define. They may not call it Sasq'ets, nor imagine it as a god, but the sensation echoes the older traditions. The forest still carries mystery, and humans still respond with caution and awe. In this way, Bigfoot remains godlike even in his modern, secularized form. He continues to embody the feeling that the world is not entirely knowable, that something greater waits just beyond the reach of human sight. In the decades following the Patterson-Gimlin film, Bigfoot entered a new phase of life, not as a hidden being in the forest, but as a figure woven into the fabric of culture. By the late 20th century, Bigfoot had become a household name in North America. Documentaries aired on late-night television, articles filled popular magazines, and cryptozoologists, researchers of hidden animals, began to collect sightings and conduct expeditions. What had once been a local being of indigenous tradition, tied to cedar groves and mountains, was now a phenomenon stretching across continents. Sightings were reported in the forests of Oregon and Washington, in the swamps of Florida where a skunk ape was said to wander, and in the mountains of Ohio and Pennsylvania. Each report added another layer to a story that seemed never to end. The late 20th century also saw the rise of Bigfoot festivals, gatherings where believers, skeptics, and the curious came together to share stories and celebrate the legend. In towns across the Pacific Northwest, banners appeared along main streets announcing Bigfoot Days or Sasq'ets festivals. Stalls sold carved wooden footprints, T-shirts with silhouettes of the famous striding figure, and mugs decorated with slogans like "I Believe." There were contests for the best Bigfoot costume, often involving shaggy suits and masks, and sometimes parades with floats shaped like enormous footprints. To walk among these festivities was to see how a once sacred figure had been transformed into a community mascot, a bringer of tourism, and a source of gentle humor. Yet beneath the laughter, there was always an undercurrent of fascination. The very fact that such festivals existed spoke to Bigfoot's enduring grip on the imagination. Tourism centered on Bigfoot became a quiet but steady industry. In Willow Creek, California, often called the Bigfoot capital of the world, a museum was established dedicated entirely to the legend. Inside, visitors could see casts of footprints, newspaper clippings, and photographs taken by witnesses. In Oregon and Washington, roadside attractions displayed plastic casts of oversized tracks, sometimes accompanied by statues of Bigfoot crafted from wood or fiberglass. These statues, often placed near gas stations or diners, invited travelers to stop, take photographs, and carry the legend onward. The commercialization of Bigfoot stripped away much of the sacred, but it also kept the figure alive, ensuring that new generations encountered the story, even if only in playful form. At the same time, television and film carried Bigfoot into living rooms worldwide. In the 1970s, shows like In Search of devoted episodes to mysterious creatures, presenting Bigfoot alongside Loch Ness and UFOs. In the 1980s and 1990s, Bigfoot appeared in family films such as Harry and the Hendersons, where he was portrayed not as frightening but as gentle. Audiences weary of Cold War anxieties and rapid technological change found comfort in imagining Bigfoot not as a threat but as a friend. In this guise, the figure once revered as Sasq'ets and feared as Dzunuqua now offered companionship, even a kind of surrogate family member. Yet not all portrayals softened him. In horror films and pulp novels, Bigfoot sometimes appeared as a menace, a lurking danger in the woods. These portrayals played on the unease of wilderness, echoing the old settler fear of the untamed forest. In this way, the dual nature of Bigfoot, protector and threat, friend and monster, persisted. Even commercial media could not entirely erase the ambiguity that had always surrounded him. The sacred ambivalence of Sasq'ets, who was both guardian and danger, continued to echo through these portrayals, though now in forms designed for cinema screens rather than potlatch halls. In quieter corners, the figure of Bigfoot continued to inspire serious belief. Across North America, individuals reported sightings, a fleeting glimpse of a tall figure crossing a road at night, the sound of heavy footsteps in the underbrush, or the discovery of oversized tracks pressed into mud or snow. Some described strange howls echoing through valleys, deep and resonant, unlike any known animal. These reports, collected by organizations such as the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, built archives of testimony. Believers often described their experiences, not in sensational terms, but with a quiet seriousness, as though they had brushed against a mystery they could not dismiss. To listen to these testimonies is to sense the persistence of reverence. Even when couched in modern language, the awe remains, the feeling of encountering something greater than oneself, something that does not easily fit within categories of animal or human. The geography of these modern sightings is telling. They often occur in the same landscapes that nurtured the older traditions, the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, the mist-shrouded valleys of the Appalachians, and the remote mountain ranges of British Columbia. These are places where human presence is light, where the sound of rivers and the calls of birds dominate, and where mist lingers between trees like a veil. To walk in such places is to feel small, to sense that the forest itself has its own life and rhythm. It is within these landscapes that Bigfoot endures most strongly, a reminder that wilderness remains, and with it, the possibility of the unseen. The role of Bigfoot in modern culture also reveals something about human needs. In an age where satellites map the Earth and technology tracks movement with precision, the idea that a being could remain hidden feels both impossible and deeply appealing. Bigfoot embodies the hope that not everything has been discovered, that there are still mysteries left in the world. This hope mirrors the reverence of earlier times, when Sasq'ets embodied the living presence of the forest. Today, the figure continues to offer connection, not always in sacred form, but in the sense that the world is larger than human control. For many, this is a source of comfort, even if they never step foot in the forests where the legend dwells. Festivals, films, and sightings together show the many lives Bigfoot now leads. He is a mascot for small towns, a character in entertainment, a subject of serious research, and an unseen presence whispered about on lonely trails. In all of these roles, he continues to carry something of his past. The reverence once given to Sasq'ets has not vanished. It has simply transformed, taking new shapes to suit new times. To buy a Bigfoot mug may seem far removed from leaving offerings in a forest grove, yet both acts acknowledge the same figure. Both keep the being alive in memory and imagination. Comparisons to other global figures underscore this point. The Yeti of the Himalayas, long spoken of in Tibetan and Nepalese traditions, has undergone similar transformations. Once a sacred guardian of mountains, he became a cryptid in Western accounts, a figure of mountaineering lore and eventually pop culture. In Mongolia and Siberia, the almas was likewise transformed from local presence to anthropological curiosity. These parallels show that Bigfoot is not unique in his journey. Sacred beings across cultures are reshaped as the world changes, but their endurance testifies to their power. In recent decades, scholars and Indigenous voices have worked to remind audiences of the deeper layers of the Sasquatch story. They emphasize that the figure is not merely a cryptid, but part of a living spiritual tradition. For some communities, Sasquatch remains a being of reverence, tied to ceremonies and to the sacredness of land. Listening to these voices allows a fuller picture to emerge, one in which Bigfoot is not only a pop culture phenomenon, but also a spiritual presence continuing to guide relationships with nature. In this way, the godlike qualities of Bigfoot are remembered, even as the wider culture embraces him in lighter forms. For those who walk in forests today, the presence of Bigfoot is often felt in silence rather than in spectacle. A hiker pauses on a trail, senses the stillness deepen, and feels watched by something unseen. A camper lying awake at night hears a distant, echoing cry that cannot be explained. These moments, quiet and fleeting, carry the essence of what Sasq'ets once embodied, the awareness that humans are not alone in the world, that the forest has its own life, and that respect is required. In these encounters, whether explained as imagination or reality, the sacred presence of Bigfoot continues. You might imagine, in a small town that has adopted Bigfoot as its local guardian of mystery, how everyday life quietly bends around the legend. A diner may serve pancakes with footprints dusted in powdered sugar, not because anyone truly believes the being walked through the kitchen, but because the idea makes breakfast feel like part of a shared story. A little gift shop might have postcards with silhouettes of towering figures among pines, and even if most customers smile at them as a joke, the items still carry a faint echo of reverence. There is a quiet comfort in objects that connect daily routines to something larger and stranger than ordinary life, even if only in playful form. In these details, the myth becomes not just entertainment, but a gentle background presence that accompanies the rhythm of the day. Festivals, too, extend this rhythm. A summer fair with a Sasquatch parade might sound light-hearted, yet beneath the costumes and cheerful floats there lingers the sense of honoring a figure that once stood for survival, wisdom, and spiritual order. When families gather in folding chairs along a main street, watching neighbors dressed in shaggy suits wave slowly at the crowd, it is both humorous and strangely ceremonial. Children laugh, adults take photos, and yet the act of creating such a celebration speaks of how communities shape identity through shared legends. It is not so different from how older societies once held festivals for gods of harvest or rain. The tone has shifted, but the structure remains familiar. People gather, people remember, and people create rituals that carry meaning beyond the surface. In quieter corners of daily life, you may picture how these stories slip into conversations. Around a campfire at night, someone might mention a rumor of a sighting, more to fill the silence than to declare belief. The fire crackles, the night air cools, and the thought of a hidden presence among the trees provides a gentle shiver before bed. In this way, Bigfoot continues to serve the same role it once did, to remind people that the world is never fully known, that even the landscape just beyond the firelight may contain something unmeasured. This thought is not necessarily frightening when spoken in calm tones. It is soothing, in fact, to imagine that the wilderness still has secrets left to keep. When you compare this with other legendary beings in modern culture, a pattern emerges. The Loch Ness Monster surfaces in festivals along the Scottish Highlands, where inflatable models and statues line the loch sides, serving as much for tourism as for tradition. The Yeti appears in Himalayan villages, painted on signs or carved in small figures, not just as a creature to fear, but as a reminder of the power and mystery of mountains. Even the chupacabra, whispered about in parts of Latin America, finds its way into artwork and stories that mix humor with unease. These beings, like Bigfoot, occupy the border between folklore and commerce, reverence and amusement. Their persistence speaks less to whether they exist in flesh, and more to how human beings prefer to keep the possibility alive. Anthropologists sometimes describe this persistence as a reflection of cultural needs. Myths of hidden creatures often thrive where people live close to nature, where forests or waters feel both generous and unpredictable. In such landscapes, a figure like Bigfoot embodies both the danger and the wisdom of the wild. When modern people continue to celebrate him, even in playful or commercial forms, they unconsciously affirm that nature is not fully conquered, not entirely explained. It is a way of keeping humility alive, a reminder that maps and science, however thorough, have not erased wonder. For someone lying in bed and listening to such thoughts, this realization can be calming, the idea that mystery still has a place in a busy, measured world. The media continues to extend this effect. Documentaries stream late into the night, showing interviews with witnesses who describe what they saw with soft conviction. The voices are steady, the accounts detailed, yet often what lingers most is not the evidence but the atmosphere, the suggestion that something vast still eludes definition. Radio shows, podcasts, and quiet late-night discussions keep the story alive for listeners who may never walk in the forests themselves. In these moments, Bigfoot functions as a companion of sorts, a gentle puzzle that asks nothing but attention, and even allows the mind to wander freely while listening. Even academics who study folklore sometimes note that disbelief does not weaken the legend. In fact, the act of doubting, of debating, may give it more strength. Each time someone asks whether Bigfoot could be real, the story renews itself, much as myths of gods once renewed when people questioned them. The role is less about proving and more about participating in a tradition of wondering. This quiet act of wonder, repeated across decades and cultures, turns Bigfoot into more than a creature. It turns him into a symbol of human restlessness, human curiosity, and the human wish that some corners of the world remain untouched by certainty. As the years pass, you may imagine that these stories will continue much the same. New sightings will be reported, new documentaries produced, new souvenirs sold at small roadside shops. Children will grow up hearing the same whispers their grandparents once heard, reshaped slightly for the times, but still carrying the same essential rhythm. And through it all, the figure of Bigfoot will shift roles again and again, from wild man to guardian, from monster to companion, from feared presence to friendly mascot. Each transformation says less about him and more about us, about the way people weave meaning into silence, into forests, into the vastness of the unknown. And so in closing, Bigfoot remains not only a myth but a mirror. He reflects the way cultures change while holding on to something ancient. He reflects the way people laugh at what once they feared and the way reverence can wear a mask of playfulness. He reflects the deep need to imagine the world as more than what is seen, to believe that behind every ridge or in every stretch of shadowed trees, there might still be a presence beyond measure. As you drift toward sleep, you might let that thought settle softly, not a thought of fear, but of gentle possibility. The forests are vast, the stories are old, and even in a world of satellites and science, it is still possible and comforting to believe in something just beyond the edge of certainty. Across these chapters, the figure of Bigfoot has shifted gently before us, taking on many forms. In the earliest stories, He was not simply a creature, but a godlike being, part of the natural and spiritual order that shaped the lives of indigenous peoples. Later, he appeared as a guardian and a reminder of humility in the wilderness, a presence that stood between human communities and the deep forests. With time, newcomers to the land reshaped him into a curiosity, a wild man, and eventually into the modern mystery of footprints and sightings. Today he lingers as a symbol woven into culture, sometimes celebrated, sometimes doubted, but never fully forgotten. Taken together, these layers reveal less about the being itself and more about human imagination. Each age has found in Bigfoot the reflection it needed, a god to respect, a warning to heed, a puzzle to discuss, or a companion of mystery to soften the edges of daily life. The story has grown and shifted, but it continues, quiet and steady, much like the forests where it began. If you found this quiet journey comforting, you're always welcome to return here whenever you'd like more calm stories to drift off to. There are many more legends waiting, some familiar, some long forgotten, all told in the same slow and steady rhythm. And if you'd like to keep them close, you can simply subscribe to Restful Legends at your own pace. For now, let the day fade, let your thoughts wander softly, and rest well.